The gala's spotlight was still hot on my shoulders when the auctioneer read the item description off his card, and I realized, standing there in a borrowed silver dress, that the item was me. "Lot 14, he announced, grinning at 300 donors in black tie. A weekend private chef experience, generously donated by our host. My husband stood at the head table, champagne in hand, and called out, loud enough for every microphone in that ballroom to catch it. "Start the bidding at $20. She's not worth much more than that anyway." The room laughed. I stood in the light with my hands folded and said nothing, because I had learned, 3 months earlier, exactly what my husband thought I was worth, and I had already done something about it that he didn't know yet. In about 90 seconds, a voice from the back of that ballroom was going to raise a paddle and change the rest of his life. Welcome to the quiet inheritance, where ordinary people face impossible betrayals and prove that the strongest response isn't always the loudest. Every story ends with a lesson, a reckoning, or a victory worth waiting for. My name is Priscilla Duval. I'm 44, and for 6 years I ran the entire back-office operation of my husband's private wealth management firm. Compliance, client onboarding, the regulatory filings that keep a firm like his out of federal crosshairs. Without a title, without a salary, and as I learned that night in the ballroom, without an ounce of respect. If you've ever poured your actual expertise into someone else's success and been handed a joke in front of a crowd as your thank you, stay with me. Comment where you're watching from and subscribe, because you need to see what was already in motion behind that microphone. I have to take you back, further than 6 years actually, to the very beginning of who I was before I ever met Marcus Duval, because I think the shape of that gala only makes sense once you understand exactly how much competence walked into that marriage, and exactly how much of it got quietly erased along the way. I grew up in a house where my father ran a small independent insurance agency, and where dinner conversations regularly turned into impromptu lessons about actuarial tables, regulatory filings, and the particular satisfaction of finding the one clause in a contract that everyone else had skimmed past. I loved it. I loved the precision of it, the way a well-drafted document could protect someone who had no idea, yet, that they needed protecting. I studied finance and business law in college, took the securities licensing exams before most of my classmates had even settled on a major, and spent my 20s building a genuinely satisfying career in regulatory compliance at a large regional bank. The kind of unglamorous, detail-obsessed work that keeps an institution's paperwork able to survive a federal audit without anyone downstream ever noticing the effort involved. By 29, I was a compliance director overseeing a team of 11, respected in a quiet, specific way by the kind of people who understood that the least visible work in an organization is often the work holding everything else up. I met Marcus at 31, at an industry conference neither of us particularly wanted to be at, in a hotel bar where he was holding court with a small crowd of relationship managers, telling a story about a client meeting that had apparently gone spectacularly, charmingly sideways, in the specific way stories tend to when told by someone who has never once doubted that he was the most interesting person in the room. I want to be honest that I found him genuinely magnetic at first, in exactly the way people describe when they talk about falling for someone who fills a room. He was funny. He was attentive, in those early months, in a way that felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. He asked me questions about my work that actually seemed to interest him, listened while I explained the specific satisfaction of catching a discrepancy in a regulatory filing before it became a 6-figure fine, and told me, more than once during our courtship, that he'd never met anyone who made compliance sound like the most interesting job in finance. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony neither of our families found particularly memorable, and for the first 2 years of our marriage, I kept my own career, my own trajectory, entirely separate from whatever Marcus was building at the mid-size wealth management firm, where he worked as a relationship manager, bringing in new clients through sheer force of personality, while other, quieter people handled the actual mechanics of managing their money once it arrived. He was good at his job, genuinely gifted at the part of finance that depends entirely on making people feel comfortable handing over their life savings to someone they've known for 6 weeks. What he was not particularly gifted at, and what became increasingly clear to me over those first 2 years of marriage, was the part of the business that actually kept a firm compliant, licensed, and legally capable of continuing to exist. Marcus began talking about starting his own firm roughly 3 years into our marriage, the way restless, talented salespeople often do once they've decided that whatever success they've built for someone else's name on the door should, by rights, belong to them directly instead. I remember the specific evening he first raised it seriously, sitting across from me at our kitchen table with a legal pad full of projected revenue figures that were, even to my untrained eye that first night, wildly optimistic. "I can't do this without you," he told me, reaching across the table to take my hand, his eyes bright with the particular certainty he always had when he'd decided something was going to happen. "You're the only person I trust to build this the right way. I need you, Priscilla. Not as, moral support. I need your actual brain on this." I want you to understand that I believed him completely, and that believing him was not naive. Exactly. Given everything I knew about how genuinely difficult it is to build a compliant financial services firm from scratch. What he was asking of me was real, substantial, necessary work that would require every ounce of the specific expertise I'd spent a decade building. I left my compliance director position at the bank 4 months later, gave up a salary, a title, a team of 11 people who had, over the years, come to genuinely respect my judgment, and walked into a rented office space with exactly 1 desk, 1 filing cabinet, and a stack of state and federal licensing applications that would take me the better part of a year to fully navigate. For 6 years, I built the compliance infrastructure of Duval Wealth Partners from absolutely nothing. I want to walk through some of what that actually meant, because I think the specificity matters, given how easily, later, all of it would be reduced to a single dismissive sentence in front of 300 people. I personally drafted the firm's entire compliance manual, the internal document that governs every single client interaction, every trade, every piece of marketing material, to ensure the firm never runs afoul of state or federal securities regulations. I personally managed the firm's registration as an investment advisor, a process that involved months of detailed filings with both state regulators, and once the firm grew large enough, the Securities and Exchange Commission itself. I built, from scratch, the entire client onboarding process, the anti-money laundering checks, the suitability assessments that ensure a client's investment strategy actually matches their financial situation and risk tolerance, the mountain of disclosure documents that protect both the client and the firm. Every single new client who walked through Duval Wealth Partners' doors, for 6 years, passed through a compliance process I had personally designed and personally executed, file by file, for the entirety of the firm's existence. I did this work full-time, exhaustively, for 6 years, and I want to be honest about the financial arrangement, because it matters enormously for everything that came later. I did not draw a salary from the firm. I did not hold any formal equity stake. Marcus and I operated, in the early years, out of a joint household account, and my compensation for 6 years of building an entire firm's regulatory backbone was, functionally, an allowance drawn from money that was, on paper, entirely his, earned through client relationships he had, admittedly, built himself. But that could not have legally existed, not for one single day, without the compliance infrastructure I had built underneath them. I raised the question of formalizing my role, more times than I can count over those 6 years, always in careful, measured conversations rather than confrontations, because Marcus, I had learned by then, responded far better to measured conversations than to anything that felt like an accusation. Each time, his answer had a familiar shape, one I recognize now, with considerable hindsight, as a particular kind of deferral disguised as partnership. "Once we're past the growth phase," he'd say, or, "let's get through this next licensing renewal first, then we'll sit down properly with an attorney and sort out titles and equity." Or, in the years when the firm was genuinely thriving, "Priscilla, come on, everything I have is yours anyway. Why do we need to make it more complicated with paperwork between us? That last version, I think, was the most effective one, because it wrapped a genuine structural inequity in the language of intimacy, made asking for formal protection feel, somehow, like a betrayal of trust rather than an entirely reasonable professional request that any business partner, married or not, would be justified in making. I want to pause here and tell you about one specific decision I made in the firm's very first year, a decision that felt, at the time, like nothing more than professional habit, the kind of unglamorous precaution a good compliance officer builds into every structure out of sheer instinct. And that would turn out, 6 years later, to be the single most important thing I ever did for myself in that entire marriage. When Marcus and I hired the attorney who drafted Duval Wealth Partners' original operating agreement, a careful, precise man named Oswaldo Furrer, whom I had specifically vetted based on his securities law background, rather than any recommendation from Marcus's social circle, I insisted, over Marcus's mild, distracted objection that it was probably unnecessary paperwork, that the agreement include a clause requiring my signature as a named party to the agreement for any material change to the firm's ownership structure. Marcus signed it without much scrutiny, eager to get the firm formally launched and viewing the specific clause, I think, as exactly the kind of dry legal formality that compliance people like me apparently enjoyed adding to things. He had no idea then, and I don't think he ever fully understood, even years later, exactly what that single clause would eventually mean. The firm grew, over those 6 years, from Marcus and me at a folding table in a rented single-room office to a genuinely substantial operation. 11 employees. A suite of offices downtown with the firm's name etched in brushed steel letters across the reception wall. Just over $400 million in client assets under management. And Marcus's face on every piece of marketing material the firm produced, under a tagline I had at the time. Thought was a little on the nose, but had never seriously objected to. Built on trust. I think about that phrase often now, the particular irony of it, given everything I would eventually learn about exactly how much of that trust I had personally, invisibly, been holding together. I began to notice a shift, roughly 18 months before that gala, subtle at first and then increasingly difficult to ignore. Marcus hired a young associate named Trent Ashby, a smooth, ambitious 29-year-old with an MBA and considerably more confidence than experience, ostensibly to help with operations, a title vague enough to mean almost anything. Within a few months, Trent had begun, gradually, sitting in on client meetings and compliance reviews that I had run entirely alone for 6 years, positioned, increasingly, as a kind of junior partner rather than the operational assistant his original hearing had implied. Marcus began introducing me, in client settings, with a phrase that I heard so many times over those 18 months that I could recite it in my sleep. "This is my wife. She helps out around the office." A description that reduced 6 years of regulatory architecture, 6 years of personally shepherding the firm through every audit and license renewal into something that sounded, to any new client hearing it, like light administrative volunteering, the kind of thing a supportive spouse does on weekends between other, more substantial commitments. I raised this pattern with Marcus more than once during those 18 months, and I want to describe those conversations honestly, because I think the specific shape of his deflection matters. The first time, early on, he seemed genuinely surprised I'd noticed, told me I was being sensitive, that of course he valued what I did, that helps out was just casual shorthand and didn't mean anything by it. The second time, several months later, after I'd pointed out a specific instance where he'd introduced Trent to a new client as our compliance lead, a title that was, at minimum, premature given that Trent had been with the firm less than a year and held none of the licensing I'd spent a decade accumulating, Marcus grew defensive in a way that felt new, told me I was creating friction where there didn't need to be any, and suggested, not for the first time, that we'd sit down properly and sort out titles and equity once Trent was fully ramped up, the same deferred promise dressed in slightly newer language. I want to be honest that I did not, even then, fully understand the shape of what was actually happening. I told myself The way I imagine many people in similarly eroding situations tell themselves that this was simply Marcus being Marcus, restless, a little careless about credit, genuinely oblivious rather than deliberately cruel. I did not yet understand that Trent Ashby's gradual elevation was not an accident of enthusiasm, but the early architecture of something Marcus had already begun planning considerably more deliberately than I gave him credit for. The moment that actually changed everything for me happened 3 months before that gala, on an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that gives no warning at all about what it's about to contain. I was going through our joint email account, a shared inbox we'd used for years for household logistics, tax documents, the mundane administrative overlap of a shared life, looking for a specific document to forward to our accountant ahead of a filing deadline. I was not looking for anything else. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters, given how easily this entire discovery could sound, told differently, like the result of some suspicious snooping I'd undertaken. I was doing ordinary household paperwork, and I found, buried 3 folders deep in an inbox neither of us checked especially carefully, a message thread between Marcus and Oswaldo Furrer, the same careful attorney who had drafted our original operating agreement 6 years earlier. Still, apparently, handling the firm's legal work, discussing, in plain, entirely unambiguous professional language, the structure of a formal ownership restructuring for Duval Wealth Partners. I read that thread standing in our kitchen, my laptop balanced on the counter, a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I read it slowly, twice, then a third time, because some part of my brain seemed determined to find an alternate interpretation that the plain language of the document simply did not support. The proposed restructuring listed Marcus Duval as 100% owner of the firm. It listed Trent Ashby as a newly granted junior equity partner with a 5% stake in recognition of his operational contributions over the preceding year. It did not list me, not as an owner, not as an equity holder. Not anywhere in 11 pages of carefully drafted legal language, at all, as though 6 years of regulatory filings bearing my own name and my own professional license simply didn't exist, as though the firm's entire ability to operate legally hadn't been built, quite literally, on paperwork I had personally authored. I want to describe what I felt, standing in that kitchen, as precisely as I can, because I think the honest version matters more than a composed one. It was not, at first, anger. It was something closer to a kind of vertigo, the specific, nauseating sensation of discovering that the floor you've been standing on for years was never quite as solid as you believed, that an entire architecture of shared purpose you'd built your adult life around had, apparently, been quietly, methodically dismantled around you while you were busy doing the actual work that kept it standing. I did not confront Marcus that night. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to, immediately, to walk into whatever room he was in and demand an explanation before the shock had even finished settling into my body. But I have spent my entire career reading dense legal documents for the one clause that changes everything. Trained by a decade of compliance work to resist the urge toward immediate reaction in favor of complete information first, and some old, disciplined instinct, the same instinct that had once made me insist, in the firm's very first year, on a co-signatory clause Marcus had barely glanced at before signing, told me to read the rest of that thread first, carefully, before I let him know I'd seen any of it. What I found, reading further into the correspondence over the following days, quietly, methodically, checking that shared inbox during moments when Marcus was at the office or asleep, was that this restructuring had been under active discussion for nearly 4 months already, considerably longer than I'd initially realized, and that Oswaldo Furrer, to his professional credit, had raised the co-signatory clause himself, early in the thread, flagging it as a potential complication. Marcus's response, dated nearly 3 months before I found any of this, read, in its entirety, "That's just boilerplate from the early days. I doubt she'd even remember it's in there. Let's proceed and handle it if it becomes an issue." I sat with that particular sentence for a long time. That's just boilerplate from the early days. I doubt she'd even remember it's in there. 6 years of my most careful professional instinct, dismissed, in a single sentence, as something so unimportant that its author assumed I'd simply forgotten it existed. If you've ever discovered that the person you built something with had already quietly written you out of it, you already know exactly the kind of stillness that settles over a person in that moment. Stay with me, because what I did with that discovery over the following 3 months is not the story Marcus was expecting, on a stage or anywhere else. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. I want to walk you through those 3 months carefully, because I think the specific texture of what I actually did matters more than any single dramatic moment, the same way I've come to believe, across an entire career of compliance work, that the unglamorous groundwork always matters more than the visible confrontation everyone remembers afterward. The first thing I did, within days of that discovery, was find an attorney of my own, entirely separate from Oswaldo Furrer, entirely separate from anyone in Marcus's professional orbit. I found her through a former colleague from my banking days, a sharp, meticulous woman named Farida Nasser, who specialized specifically in partnership and shareholder disputes, particularly in financial services, the kind of attorney who had, in her own words during our first meeting, spent a career watching exactly this dynamic play out between spouses who built a business together. And it never once surprises me how often the person doing the invisible work gets erased from the official story. I brought Farida the original operating agreement, 6 years old by then, along with the email thread I'd discovered, and watched her read through both with the same careful, unhurried attention I imagine I'd have given a suspicious client file back in my banking days. When she finally looked up, she confirmed exactly what I had suspected reading that thread alone in my kitchen. The co-signatory clause I'd insisted on including, that offhand piece of professional habit from the firm's earliest, most uncertain days, was legally binding, and critically, had never been formally amended or waived. Any material restructuring of the firm's ownership without my documented, written consent would be legally invalid, full stop, regardless of what Marcus and his attorney believed they were quietly finalizing. He has no idea what he actually signed 6 years ago, does he? Farida said, and it wasn't really a question. I don't think he's thought about that agreement once since the day he signed it, I told her. Good, she said, that's going to matter. I want to be clear about something, because I think it's the part of this story people sometimes misunderstand about people like me. I did not, in those early weeks, immediately plan to use that co-signatory clause as a weapon, or even necessarily as leverage. My first instinct, genuinely, was defensive rather than offensive. I wanted, more than anything, simply to understand the full scope of what was actually happening before I did anything at all, and to make sure that whatever I eventually decided to do, I would be doing it from a position of complete information rather than raw, reactive hurt. Over the following weeks, Farida and I worked through, methodically, exactly what my legal position actually was. The co-signatory clause protected me from an unauthorized restructuring, yes, but it did not, on its own, formally establish any ownership stake I'd actually be entitled to going forward, since 6 years of undocumented labor, however extensive, does not automatically convert itself into legal equity simply because it should, morally, have been recognized as such from the beginning. Farida was careful, in those early conversations, not to promise me an outcome she couldn't yet guarantee, explaining, patiently, that the strongest path forward would likely combine the leverage of the co-signatory clause with a broader, carefully documented accounting of my actual contributions to the firm's founding and ongoing operation, the kind of accounting that could, eventually, support either a formal negotiated equity stake, or, if it came to that, a considerably stronger financial settlement than I'd have any claim to otherwise. So I began, quietly, alongside my ongoing compliance work at the firm, which I continued performing at exactly the same exhaustive standard I always had, because I understood, even in the middle of this discovery, that letting the firm's actual regulatory standing slip in retaliation would only weaken my own position and potentially expose real clients to real risk, building a complete, dated record of my 6 years of work. I pulled every regulatory filing I had personally authored, going back to the firm's very first licensing application. I compiled every compliance manual revision, every audit response, every client onboarding file that bore my signature or my professional license number rather than anyone else's. I gathered carefully a timeline of every instance, going back years, where I had personally identified and corrected a compliance issue before it became a reportable violation. The kind of invisible, preventative work that never makes it into a firm's marketing materials, but that, without which, a firm like Duval Wealth Partners simply could not have continued operating for 6 consecutive years without a serious regulatory incident. I also did something during those months that Marcus never anticipated, because he had never once, across our entire marriage, thought to ask what I might be capable of building beyond the work I did for his firm. I began, quietly in the evenings after he'd gone to sleep, laying the groundwork for my own independent advisory practice, researching the specific licensing requirements for launching a registered investment advisory firm under my own name, requirements I understood, frankly, better than almost anyone in the state, given that I had personally navigated nearly identical requirements for Duval Wealth Partners 6 years earlier. I began, methodically, the application process for my own registered investment advisor license, a process that took the better part of 2 months to fully complete, working entirely under my own name, my own professional history, my own decade of demonstrated regulatory expertise, none of which required Marcus's knowledge or permission, since every credential involved belonged, entirely and unambiguously, to me. By the time that gala arrived, 3 months after my discovery in the kitchen, I had already secured my own independent real license. I had already, carefully and discreetly, begun reaching out to a small number of Duval Wealth Partners' longest-standing individual clients, people who had, over 6 years, come to trust me personally with the most sensitive, granular details of their financial lives, their estate planning concerns, their tax situations, the specific compliance questions that Marcus, in all his charm, had never once been equipped to answer as thoroughly or as carefully as I could, letting them know, quietly. In one-on-one conversations framed as simple professional courtesy, that I would soon be launching an independent practice, should they, at some future point, ever wish to have someone with my specific regulatory background handling their affairs directly. I want to be honest that this outreach was careful, measured, and entirely within the bounds of what Farida assured me was legally and ethically permissible. I made no disparaging comments about Marcus or the firm, solicited no immediate business, and simply informed a small number of trusted clients of a professional development in my own career, the same way any professional in any industry is entitled to inform their network of an upcoming change. Among those clients was a woman named Jorah Whitfield, a retired cardiothoracic surgeon in her late 60s with a portfolio just north of $30 million, someone I had personally managed the compliance and detailed quarterly reporting for since practically the firm's earliest days, someone who had, over 6 years, developed a genuine trust in my specific attention to detail that had, I think, always slightly exceeded whatever trust she held for Marcus's considerably lighter-touch relationship management style. I told Jorah, over coffee, 6 weeks before that gala, exactly what I told my other longest-standing clients, that I was launching my own practice, that I hoped, should she ever want it, she'd consider working with me directly. I did not tell her about the ownership restructuring or about what I'd discovered in that email thread. I did not, at that point, even fully know what I intended to do with any of it beyond quietly, carefully protecting my own future. The gala that night was, by grim, almost absurd coincidence, the same annual charity fundraiser Duval Wealth Partners had for years donated to as a matter of routine corporate goodwill, an event I had personally coordinated the firm's involvement with every single year, right down to the specific auction item the firm always contributed. A private chef dining experience, donated in the firm's name, that I had in past years personally arranged with the caterer. Personally described in the auction program copy, personally made sure arrived exactly as promised for whichever winning bidder claimed it. I remember getting dressed for that gala with no particular sense of foreboding, choosing a borrowed silver dress from a friend because the black tie events Marcus insisted we attend had never felt worth the expense of an entirely separate wardrobe, given how rarely I actually enjoyed them. I remember the specific, mundane texture of that evening's early hours. The cocktail reception, the small talk with donors I half recognized from years of these same events, Marcus working the room with his usual effortless charm, 3 glasses of champagne into an evening that had not yet, from my vantage point, shown any sign of becoming the pivot point of my entire adult life. The auction began roughly 90 minutes into the evening. The auctioneer, a booming, practiced man I'd worked with for years on the logistics of exactly this kind of event, moving briskly through a dozen items, a week at a lake house, a signed piece of sports memorabilia, a private wine tasting, before reaching lot 14. I remember, with a specificity that has never faded, the exact moment I understood what was about to happen, watching Marcus, 3 glasses of champagne deep, lean toward the auctioneer's table with an expression I recognized as the particular, slightly performative confidence he wore whenever he'd decided, in the moment, that a bit of spontaneous showmanship would land well with a crowd. Lot 14, the auctioneer announced, reading off his card with the same practiced enthusiasm he'd applied to every previous item. A weekend private chef experience, generously donated by our host, Duval Wealth Partners. Marcus, standing at the head table, champagne glass raised, called out, loud enough for every microphone positioned around that ballroom to catch it clearly, loud enough that I understood, instantly, this was not a private joke meant for the small cluster of colleagues immediately around him. "Start the bidding at $20, he said, grinning out at the room. "She's not worth much more than that anyway." I want to be precise about what happened in the ballroom in the seconds immediately following that sentence, because I have replayed it enough times to know exactly how it unfolded. There was a beat of confused silence, the particular silence of a room trying to determine whether it had just heard something genuinely funny or something it should be uncomfortable about. And then, led by a handful of tables closest to Marcus who had clearly decided, collectively, to interpret it as harmless self-deprecating humor about his own wife's culinary skills. A wave of laughter rolled through the ballroom, uneven, scattered, but real. I stood in the auctioneer's spotlight, because I understood, standing there, that she in Marcus's joke was, unambiguously, me, positioned near the stage as I had been every year, coordinating the item's logistics, with my hands folded in front of me, and I said absolutely nothing. I want to explain, as honestly as I can, what was actually happening inside me during that particular silence, because I think it's the part of this story people most want to understand. It was not, primarily, humiliation, though there was certainly a hot, specific sting of it. It was something closer to a strange, clarifying confirmation, the plain, public articulation, in front of 300 witnesses, of exactly the private dynamic I had already discovered, 3 months earlier, sitting alone in my own kitchen reading an email thread that had quietly written me out of the very firm I'd built. Marcus had already decided what I was worth. I had simply not, until that exact moment, watched him say it out loud to a room. I stood in that spotlight, and I did not cry, and I did not laugh along, and I did not, as some part of the crowd perhaps expected, offer some gracious, self-deprecating comment of my own to smooth over the moment. I simply stood there, still, while the room's laughter continued for a few seconds longer than I think anyone expected, before beginning, gradually, to falter against the particular tension of my own visible silence. If you've ever stood in a spotlight while someone you built your entire life alongside told a room full of strangers exactly how little he thought of you, you already know precisely the kind of stillness that takes over a person in that moment. Stay with me, because the voice that answered him from the back of that ballroom is the part of this story I've been building toward this whole time. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. The voice that broke the room's uneven laughter came from a table near the back, near enough to the doors that I hadn't fully registered, until that exact moment, that Jorah Whitfield had arrived at the gala at all that year. She had, I later learned, come as a guest of another longtime donor, a detail she had simply never mentioned to me during our coffee 6 weeks earlier, since neither of us had any particular reason at the time to think it relevant. Adjora stood, unhurried, raising a paddle high enough for every table in that ballroom to see clearly, and her voice, when it came, carried the particular calm authority of a woman who had spent 4 decades in operating rooms making life-and-death decisions under pressure, and had, as a direct consequence, very little patience left in her life for performative cruelty dressed up as charm. $2 million, she said, into a ballroom that had, in the space of that single sentence, gone completely, absolutely silent. The auctioneer, visibly startled, glanced down at his card as though checking whether he'd somehow misread the item description. Adjora did not wait for him to recover. "Not for the weekend," she continued, her voice carrying easily across the now silent room without any need for a microphone. "For her. Effective immediately, Marcus. I'm moving my entire portfolio to Priscilla's new independent practice. And given what I just watched you do to the woman who has personally kept this firm compliant and out of regulatory trouble for 6 straight years, I suspect I won't be the only client at this event doing exactly that before the night is over." I want to describe Marcus's face in that specific moment as precisely as I can, because I have turned it over in my mind many, many times since. His practiced, charming smile did not fall away all at once, the way I think a smile does in a film, dramatically, instantly. It simply, slowly, stopped functioning, the specific way a machine does when the one component that actually made it run has quietly failed, leaving the general shape of a smile arranged on his face with none of its actual purpose left behind it. He looked, in that moment, like a man doing rapid, panicked arithmetic in real time, watching a number $2 million, and everything that particular number implied about who else in that room might follow, reorganize itself into a catastrophe he had no immediate script prepared for. I did not speak in that moment, either. I want to be honest that some part of me, watching Marcus's composure crack open in front of 300 witnesses, felt something I am not entirely proud of, a hot, satisfying flash of vindication that I don't think anyone, watching this story, should feel obligated to pretend I didn't experience. But I also understood, standing there, that the actual work, the 6 years of regulatory filings, the co-signatory clause, the carefully secured license, the months of methodical preparation, had already been done, quietly, before that ballroom ever existed as a stage for any of it, and that Adjora's paddle, however dramatic, was simply the moment the truth I'd already assembled finally found an audience large enough to make it undeniable. What followed over the next several weeks unfolded with a speed that even I, having spent 3 months quietly preparing for exactly this kind of moment, found somewhat startling to actually live through. Adjora's public statement that night, made in front of 300 of the region's wealthiest donors, and as it turned out, at least 2 local business journalists who had been covering the gala for the society and lifestyle sections of the regional paper, set off a chain reaction among Duval Wealth Partners' client base that Marcus, for all his charm, simply had no real tools to stop. Word travels with remarkable speed among wealthy clients who share the same charity circuits, the same country clubs, the same casual social overlap that comes with occupying similar economic strata in a mid-sized city. Within the first week, I received calls, entirely unsolicited, from 4 other longtime clients, people I had personally handled compliance and detailed reporting for over the years, each of them asking, in careful, curious language, exactly what had happened at that gala, and each of them, once I gave them the same measured, factual account I'd give anyone, asking directly whether I would be willing to manage their accounts personally, going forward. I want to pause here and describe something Farida told me, in the days immediately following the gala, that I found genuinely useful in navigating what came next. "You need to be very careful right now," she said, "not to actively solicit clients away from the firm while you're still, technically, an employee there, even an unpaid one. But you are absolutely allowed to answer honestly when clients come to you asking what happened and what your plans are." There's a real, important legal line between poaching and simply being visible and honest when people come looking for you on their own. That distinction became, over the following weeks, the guiding principle for essentially everything I did. Marcus attempted, in the first days after the gala, to manage the fallout the way he managed most professional crises. Through charm, through a kind of confident, reassuring messaging aimed at smoothing over what he seemed to genuinely believe was a temporary, manageable embarrassment, rather than the structural collapse it was rapidly becoming. He sent a firm-wide client letter, 4 days after the gala, that Farida later obtained a copy of during the formal negotiations. A letter that emphasized his own years of relationship leadership at the firm, and characterized the gala incident as an unfortunate joke that landed poorly, language that, according to several clients who mentioned it to me directly, read less as a persuasive case for staying with the firm and more as unintentional confirmation of exactly the dynamic Ajora had called out publicly. A firm led by a man who still, even in his formal apology, seemed to fundamentally misunderstand what he'd actually revealed about himself. Farida formally invoked my co-signatory rights on the firm's operating agreement the following week, a legal step that had a considerably more immediate and consequential effect than Marcus's client letter. The invocation formally blocked his previously planned restructuring, the one that would have converted the firm's ownership entirely to himself, with Trent Ashby's 5% stake, and my name nowhere on the document at all, and, critically, forced a formal legal accounting of the firm's true ownership and founding contributions as part of the resulting dispute resolution process, since my co-signatory rights, once formally asserted, could not simply be waved away or negotiated around without genuine, documented engagement with exactly how the firm had actually come to exist in the first place. That accounting process, which took the better part of 6 weeks to complete, produced a document I keep, still in a folder in my new office, not out of any particular need to reference it practically, but because I think I needed, for my own sake, a formal, undeniable, legally reviewed record of exactly what 6 years of my labor had actually built. It confirmed, in language considerably more precise than anything Marcus had ever offered me directly across our entire marriage, that I had personally authored the firm's original licensing applications, personally managed 100% of its regulatory filings for the entirety of its 6-year existence, and personally identified and corrected no fewer than 11 distinct compliance issues over those 6 years that, left unaddressed, could plausibly have resulted in significant regulatory sanctions, or, in at least 2 documented instances, the potential loss of the firm's operating license entirely. Meanwhile, the client exodus that had begun with Ajora's paddle in that ballroom continued, and accelerated, over the following 4 months, in a way that Marcus, increasingly, had no meaningful strategy to counter. Clients who had spent years working directly with me on the granular, detailed compliance reviews and quarterly reporting that actually protected their financial interests, rather than with Marcus's considerably lighter-touch relationship management, began, one after another, formally requesting their account transfers to my new independent practice, which I had, by then, formally launched under the name Duval and Nasser Regulatory Advisory. Farida had, over those same weeks, transitioned from simply being my attorney to becoming my actual business partner, an arrangement neither of us had planned, but that made, once we discussed it seriously, an enormous amount of practical sense, given how closely our respective expertise complemented each other. I want to describe, honestly, what those 4 months felt like from the inside, because I think the emotional texture matters as much as the practical outcome. It was not, despite how it might sound described this way, purely triumphant. There were entire evenings during those months where I sat alone in my new, still mostly empty office, surrounded by boxes of files I'd painstakingly copied and organized from 6 years of work, and felt something considerably heavier than vindication. A genuine, complicated grief for the marriage I had believed, for years, was a real partnership, and for the specific version of Marcus I had fallen for at that hotel bar conference more than a decade earlier, a version I understood. Increasingly, over those months, might never have fully existed in the way I'd wanted to believe it did. Marcus and I separated formally within 6 weeks of the gala, a process that moved, given everything already unfolding around the firm. With a kind of grim, business-like efficiency, neither of us had the emotional energy to resist. He did not, in the end, contest the divorce terms particularly aggressively, something Farida attributed, with characteristic bluntness, to the fact that he had considerably bigger problems to manage by that point than the specifics of a divorce settlement, given what was simultaneously happening to the firm's client base and regulatory standing. That regulatory standing, as it turned out, became the final, decisive factor in how the entire situation ultimately resolved. Several of the clients who transferred their accounts to my new practice in those first months did so alongside their own independent legal and financial advisors, professionals who, in the course of formally reviewing the transfer paperwork, began asking pointed questions about the ongoing compliance status of Duval Wealth Partners now that the person who had personally managed that compliance for 6 years was no longer involved. I want to be clear that I did not, at any point, disparage the firm's compliance standing to departing clients or their advisors. Farida had been emphatic, throughout this entire process, that doing so could expose me to real legal liability, and I had no interest, professionally or personally, in making false or exaggerated claims about anything. What I did do, when directly asked by a client's own independent advisor about specific regulatory gaps, was answer honestly and precisely, the same way I would answer any professional inquiry within my actual area of expertise, and what those honest, precise answers revealed. Increasingly, was that certain routine compliance functions, quarterly filings, updated suitability assessments, the unglamorous maintenance work that never makes headlines, but that keeps a firm legally sound, had in fact begun slipping in the months since I'd stopped performing them, exactly as I privately suspected they would, given that Trent Ashby's operational experience, however much confidence he projected, simply did not include the specific regulatory training I had spent a decade accumulating. Within 4 months of that gala, Duval Wealth Partners had lost just over 60% of its assets under management. The firm's operating license came under increased scrutiny from state regulators after at least 2 transferring clients' new advisory teams formally flagged compliance gaps that had emerged in the preceding months, gaps that, once investigated, traced directly back to exactly the kind of oversight failures I had spent 6 years personally preventing. Marcus, facing a firm hemorrhaging both clients and regulatory standing simultaneously, with no realistic path back to the operational stability the business had once enjoyed, ultimately agreed, through several weeks of increasingly tense negotiation between Farida and Oswaldo Furrer, to a formal dissolution and buyout agreement that finally, fully, unambiguously recognized my documented contribution to the firm's founding value, a settlement that, while it will never fully compensate for 6 years of unpaid, uncredited labor, or for the particular public humiliation of that gala, at least gave me, finally, the kind of formal, legal acknowledgement that 6 years of careful, patient work had always deserved and had never once, until that ballroom, received. I did not take satisfaction, in the end, from watching Duval Wealth Partners collapse, because I understood, more clearly than almost anyone else involved could have, exactly how much genuine work, mine, had gone into building something that had, at one point, deserved a considerably better outcome than a founder who treated his most essential partner as a punchline in front of 300 people. There is a version of this story, I think, where I feel nothing but clean, uncomplicated triumph watching that firm come apart, and I want to be honest that this is not quite that version. What I took satisfaction from, instead, was something quieter, and I think, considerably more durable, standing, 6 months after that gala, in the small, meticulously compliant office of my own firm, with Ajora Whitfield's $30 million portfolio, and 11 other client relationships I had spent 6 years earning honestly, patiently, and unmistakably, finally operating under my own name, on my own license, answerable to no one's careless joke about what I was worth. I want to tell you about one more conversation before I close this out, because I think it matters. A juror came into my office roughly 2 months after the gala, ostensibly for a routine portfolio review, and near the end of our meeting, almost as an aside, asked me whether I'd ever actually thanked her properly for what she'd done that night. I told her honestly that I hadn't been entirely sure how to, that thank you for publicly announcing a $2 million bid for me at a charity gala wasn't a sentence I'd had much occasion to practice. She laughed, genuinely, and told me something I've thought about often since. I didn't do it for drama, Priscilla, she said. I did it because I've spent 40 years in operating rooms watching brilliant, meticulous women get introduced as somebody's assistant by men who couldn't survive a single day doing the actual work those women did without complaint. I was tired of watching it happen again in a ballroom. That's all that was. Here's what I learned, sitting in that quiet office some evenings now, going over compliance filings that finally, after 6 years, carry my own signature on every single page, with no one else's name required alongside it to make the work legitimate. People can auction off your worth publicly, in front of a room full of witnesses, if they've spent years quietly convincing themselves, in private, that it was never worth very much to begin with. But the actual foundation of what you built together, if you were careful enough, patient enough, disciplined enough to document your own value properly along the way, even if that documentation started as nothing more than an unglamorous, half-considered clause in a 6-year-old operating agreement, does not simply disappear just because someone else forgot or chose never to see exactly how much of it depended on you. It only needs the right room, eventually, and the right voice to finally say the true number out loud. If you've ever had your worth auctioned off, quietly in private conversations or publicly in front of a crowd, by someone who owed you considerably more credit than they ever gave, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. Document your own value, clearly, in writing, in whatever partnership or shared work currently defines your life, long before you ever find yourself needing that paperwork to speak louder than someone else's careless joke. Comment the one who raised the paddle if you made it to the end with me. Share this with someone who's ever been underestimated by the exact person who owed them the most credit, and subscribe to the quiet inheritance, because there's always another ballroom, another auction, and another truth waiting patiently for the right voice, at the right moment, to finally call it out loud.